My beloved child, wait. Something changed in the room the moment he stopped pretending he had no questions. It wasn't loud at first. There was no dramatic entrance, no raised voice, no scene anyone could have predicted. There was only a silence that had been growing between them for far too long, the kind of silence created when one person knows there is more to the story and the other keeps hoping the missing pieces will never be noticed. He had been carrying that feeling quietly. A sentence that didn't quite make sense. A detail that changed every time it was mentioned. The way she became strangely careful whenever your name entered the conversation. Individually, none of those things seemed important enough to confront. Together, they had begun forming a question he could no longer ignore. And on this particular day, something small finally brought everything to the surface. He looked at her differently. Not with anger. Not even with accusation. With clarity. That was what unsettled her most. Because she realized he wasn't asking casually anymore. He already understood that something had been hidden. He simply wanted to know why. And then, after a long pause, he said the words she had been hoping he would never put together, "You never told me why you." He stopped there for a second, almost as if he were giving her one final opportunity to tell the truth without being pushed. She knew exactly how that sentence ended. So did he. And somehow, the unfinished words carried more weight than a complete accusation ever could. Don't skip, because what followed wasn't really about one secret. It was about the reason that secret had been kept from him in the first place. Her expression changed immediately. The confidence she had used whenever the subject came close to you disappeared. She looked away, then tried to return the conversation to something safer. But he didn't follow her there. For once, he stayed with the question. Calmly. Quietly. Completely. And that was when she realized she could no longer control the direction of the conversation. For a long time, she had believed that if she gave him only selected pieces of information, he would naturally arrive at the conclusion she wanted. She didn't necessarily invent an entirely different reality. The secret was subtler than that. She left things out. She emphasized certain moments and minimized others. She described your distance without explaining what happened before it. She mentioned your silence without telling him what you may have been protecting yourself from. She allowed him to believe that your actions meant one thing while privately knowing there could have been another explanation. And because he trusted the version he was hearing, he never thought to ask what was missing. Until now. Something important is waiting for you here, because what finally made him question everything wasn't some extraordinary discovery. It was a contradiction so simple that once he noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. She had told him you didn't care enough to make an effort. Yet somewhere along the way, he learned about an effort you had made that she never mentioned. Maybe it was a message. Maybe it was the way you tried to make peace quietly instead of turning the situation into a battle. Maybe it was something you said when nobody expected kindness from you. Whatever the detail was, it didn't match the picture he had been given. And the more he thought about it, the more one realization began settling into him. If she had hidden this detail, what else had she decided he didn't need to know? That question changed his posture. He wasn't trying to prove you perfect. He wasn't suddenly erasing every complicated moment. He simply wanted the full story. And the third party could feel the difference immediately. This wasn't jealousy anymore. This wasn't competition. It was something far more difficult to influence, someone beginning to think for himself. She tried explaining that she had only wanted to protect him. He listened. She said there were things she believed would confuse him. He listened again. She suggested that maybe she had misunderstood a few details. Still, he remained calm. And then he asked the question beneath all the other questions: why didn't you let me decide what it meant? That was the moment her composure truly slipped. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't. But because he had finally identified the one thing she couldn't explain away. It wasn't merely what she had told him. It was that she had quietly taken away his opportunity to see the situation clearly for himself. And suddenly, every conversation they had shared about you began looking different. Stay till the end, because this is where something deeply personal began changing inside him. He remembered moments when he had almost reached out to you and stopped. Moments when curiosity had pulled him toward the truth, only for another conversation to convince him that keeping distance was easier. Moments when something about the story felt incomplete, yet he dismissed the feeling because trusting someone nearby seemed simpler than reopening an emotional door. Now those memories were returning one by one. Not to punish him. To teach him. And what he began understanding was surprisingly gentle. Sometimes people do not lose connection because the feeling disappeared. Sometimes they lose connection because they begin reacting to interpretations instead of speaking directly to the person involved. That realization stayed with him. He thought about you in a way he had avoided for a while, not as the version someone described, but as the person he had actually experienced. Your expressions. Your patience. The small ways you had shown care. Even the moments when you withdrew began making more sense when he considered what you might have been feeling instead of what someone else had told him your silence meant. And there was one memory in particular that kept returning. A moment when you could have made everything about yourself, but didn't. Maybe you stepped away rather than creating conflict. Maybe you chose restraint when a louder reaction would have been easier. At the time, he interpreted that as distance. Now he wondered whether it had actually been dignity. That possibility affected him more deeply than he expected. Because when a person realizes they may have misunderstood someone important, the first emotion is not always regret. Sometimes it is tenderness. A quiet wish to go back and look again. To listen without assumptions. To understand what they missed. The third party sensed that shift, and this was where her frustration rose. She began talking faster, explaining more than he had asked, trying to restore the certainty he once had. Yet each extra explanation created another question. He noticed how often her sentences began with what she thought you meant instead of what you had actually said. He noticed how confidently she described feelings that belonged to you, even though she had never truly asked you about them. And slowly, something remarkable happened. He stopped arguing with her. He no longer needed to. His quietness wasn't agreement. It was observation. He was finally separating fact from interpretation. And that made the room feel completely different. There is something you may need to hear in this part, my beloved child. Being misunderstood does not always require you to chase every misunderstanding and correct it. Sometimes the truth becomes visible because inconsistency eventually reveals itself. Sometimes your calmness says what endless explanations never could. And sometimes the person who needed to understand simply wasn't ready to look carefully before. But when they finally do, they begin noticing details that were always there. He was noticing them now. The third party asked him why he suddenly cared so much about knowing the complete story. His answer surprised even him. He said, quietly, "Because it matters who I become when I only hear one side." And for a moment, nobody spoke. That sentence wasn't only about you anymore. It was about him. He had begun questioning whether he had allowed someone else's certainty to replace his own judgment. Whether he had been too quick to accept convenient explanations because confronting his real feelings would have required courage. Whether part of him had wanted to believe the easiest version because the alternative meant admitting your connection still mattered. That last realization was the one he didn't say aloud. Not yet. But she saw it in his face. And perhaps that was why her emotions finally became difficult to hide. She asked him whether he was seriously considering speaking to you again. He didn't answer immediately. That pause told her enough. She repeated the question. He looked down for a moment, almost gathering his thoughts, and when he finally looked back at her, there was no confusion in his expression anymore. "I'm considering hearing the truth from the person I should have asked in the first place." Nothing about those words was harsh. Yet they changed everything. Because he was no longer asking the third party to define you for him. He was considering meeting you without the filter of someone else's interpretation. And there was something else she hadn't expected. He wasn't rushing toward you with some perfect speech. He wasn't imagining that one conversation would solve every uncertainty. He simply wanted honesty. That grounded intention made his decision stronger, not weaker. He wanted to know what you remembered. What you had felt. What you had tried to say. What you may have held back because you assumed he had already chosen what to believe. And somewhere inside that thought was an emotion he had not allowed himself to name for a long time. He missed the version of himself that felt safe enough to be honest with you. The room became quieter after that. The third party's explanations softened. Perhaps she finally understood that trying harder to control the story would only push him further toward finding the answers himself. She admitted that she had been afraid. Not of you exactly. Of what might happen if he saw you clearly again. She had noticed something between you that she couldn't easily dismiss. A certain softness in him whenever your name appeared. A hesitation before he agreed with negative interpretations. A way his attention changed whenever there was even the smallest possibility of hearing from you. She had seen those signs and convinced herself that withholding certain details would make everything simpler. But simplicity built on incomplete information rarely remains simple forever. And now he understood why she had done it. That didn't make every choice acceptable. But it gave the confrontation a surprising emotional turn. He no longer saw her as some mysterious force standing between you. He saw a person who had acted from insecurity and had allowed that insecurity to shape what she shared. And once he saw that, her influence over his perception began shrinking. Because hidden motives lose much of their power when they are finally named. Something important is waiting for you beyond this moment, because just when it seemed the conversation had reached its deepest point, she admitted one final detail. A detail he had never heard before. Something connected to a moment when you had apparently tried to reach him or tried to leave the door open in a way he never knew about. She started the sentence carefully. There was one other thing I didn't tell you. He looked at her without moving. And suddenly the question that had started everything "You never told me why you," was no longer the biggest question in the room. Because what she revealed next made him realize that the distance between you may not have happened exactly the way he had believed. And before he could respond, one memory came rushing back to him with a completely different meaning, a memory involving you, a message, and the one choice he now wished he had understood sooner. The memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the exact moment your name had appeared on his phone, the hesitation that followed, and the strange feeling that there had been more behind that moment than he understood at the time. Back then, he had assumed your silence afterward meant you had changed your mind. He had accepted that explanation because it was easier than asking another question. But now, sitting across from the person who had just admitted that one important detail had been withheld, he suddenly wondered whether he had ever known the full story at all. The third party lowered her eyes before continuing. She told him there had been another message. Not something dramatic. Not some extraordinary confession. Something quieter than that, which somehow made it matter even more. You had tried to explain yourself. You had tried to make it clear that your distance wasn't rejection. You simply didn't want to force yourself into a situation where you felt unwanted. And the third party had known. She had seen enough to understand that your silence carried a completely different meaning from the one he had been given. For several seconds, he said nothing. That silence wasn't empty. It was filled with memories rearranging themselves. Moments he had labeled incorrectly. Choices he thought you made without caring. Times he convinced himself that letting go was what you wanted because someone else had quietly helped him believe it. Don't skip, because what he realized next was not about blaming anyone. It was about recognizing how easily two people can move farther apart while both secretly believing the other person chose the distance. He asked her one simple question. Why didn't you tell me? She opened her mouth, but no answer came immediately. For the first time, she seemed to understand that explaining her actions would require admitting something about herself she had avoided confronting. Eventually, she said she believed that if he knew you were still open to talking, he would go back toward you. There it was. Not a complicated plan. Not some unbelievable secret. Just insecurity. She had been afraid that giving him the whole truth would allow him to make a choice she didn't want him to make. And strangely, hearing that gave him more clarity than anger ever could. Because now the pieces matched. The interruptions. The selective details. The way conversations about you always seemed to end with him doubting what he had personally felt. He had mistaken someone else's fear for certainty. And once he understood that, something inside him became very still. He leaned back and remembered a conversation you had shared long before everything became complicated. You had said something simple about how you never wanted to be someone's forced choice. At the time, he barely noticed those words. Now they came back with a weight he wasn't prepared for. Maybe your distance had never been a demand for him to chase you. Maybe you had simply been protecting your own dignity while leaving enough space for him to decide for himself. That thought softened him. He began to understand that what he once called your coldness may actually have been restraint. What he called indifference may have been uncertainty. And what he called an ending may have been two people waiting for clarity that never arrived. Something important is waiting for you here, because he did not immediately reach for his phone. That would have been easy. Instead, he remained where he was and asked himself a harder question: if he contacted you now, would he be doing it because he genuinely wanted to understand you, or because discovering the truth had made him emotional? He didn't want to approach you carelessly. He knew that if he opened that door again, he needed to come without assumptions, without someone else's version of the past, and without expecting you to repair feelings he had never expressed. This was where his perspective began to mature. He wasn't thinking about winning you back like something he had lost. He was thinking about whether he could finally meet you honestly. There is a difference. And somewhere in that difference was the beginning of something much more meaningful than a dramatic reunion. It was accountability. He remembered the times you gave him opportunities to ask what was really happening, and he chose silence. He remembered the moments when he wanted to trust his own experience of you but allowed outside opinions to become louder. And instead of turning those memories into shame, he allowed them to teach him. "I should have asked her," he said quietly. The third party looked at him. "Asked her what?" He paused. Then the answer came naturally. What she actually felt. Those words changed the atmosphere again. Because he realized he had spent so much time wondering what you meant that he had rarely given you the chance to tell him. He had interpreted your pauses. Interpreted your distance. Interpreted the way you responded when things became complicated. Yet interpretation had become a substitute for conversation. And suddenly he saw how unfair that had been to you, but also to himself. Stay till the end, because the third party's next admission was the one thing he truly wasn't expecting. She told him there had been a night when you almost reached out again. You had apparently asked whether he was doing well. Nothing more. No dramatic declaration. No attempt to pull him away from anyone. You simply wanted to know whether he was okay. She had never mentioned it. She convinced herself that the message was insignificant. But now, when she repeated what you had said, he recognized something instantly. It sounded exactly like you. Quiet concern. No pressure. No demand. Just care offered without asking for anything back. He looked away, and for the first time that evening, his composure softened. Because he remembered that same quality in you from long before everything became uncertain. You had always noticed small things. The change in his voice when something was bothering him. The way he became quiet when he was overwhelmed. The details other people skipped over because they appeared unimportant. He had forgotten how deeply being seen by you had affected him. Or perhaps he hadn't forgotten. Perhaps he had simply trained himself not to think about it. And now one small message had brought that feeling back. Not as fantasy. As memory. Real, specific, undeniable memory. The third party noticed his expression and asked, almost reluctantly, "You still care about her, don't you?" He didn't answer quickly. That question required more honesty than any of the others. His eyes dropped to the floor. His hands rested still. Then he said, "I don't think I ever understood what I was trying not to feel." That was all. No sweeping declaration. No impossible promise. Just one honest sentence from someone finally willing to examine his own heart instead of letting someone else explain it for him. And strangely, the third party stopped defending herself. Maybe she understood there was nothing left to defend. Maybe she finally saw that his feelings were not something she could negotiate away by presenting a better argument. Feelings can be questioned. They can be examined. They can change. But they cannot be rewritten simply because someone else is uncomfortable with them. The conversation softened after that. She admitted she had noticed his feelings long before he was willing to acknowledge them. That was partly why she became so careful about what she told him. Every time your name came up, he changed slightly. Sometimes it was nothing more than a pause. Sometimes a question he tried to make sound casual. Sometimes the way he remembered a detail about you that he supposedly no longer cared about. She saw those little signs, and instead of trusting him to understand them himself, she tried to manage what he knew. But now that admission gave him another realization. Maybe the strongest sign of what he felt wasn't some grand gesture. Maybe it was the fact that, even after all the distance, he still remembered you in details. Your expressions. Certain phrases you used. A place you once mentioned wanting to visit. The way you laughed when you were trying not to. Tiny things that had remained without his permission. He smiled faintly at one of those memories before catching himself. The third party saw it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And in that quiet moment, he understood why this confrontation had felt so different from every previous conversation. It wasn't giving him a new feeling. It was removing the noise around an old one. Something important was becoming clearer, but he still knew one thing: your side of the story belonged to you. He could not create it in his imagination. He needed to hear it from you. That recognition kept him grounded. He wasn't going to assume that because he had discovered missing information, everything between you could simply return to how it once was. Time had passed. You had lived through your own thoughts, your own disappointments, your own growth. Maybe you had changed. Maybe he had changed too. If another conversation ever happened, it needed to honor the people you both were now, not the people you remembered being before everything became complicated. And that was when he finally reached for his phone. He unlocked the screen, searched your name, and stopped. His thumb hovered above the place where one message could reopen a conversation he had believed was finished. But instead of typing immediately, he closed his eyes for a moment. There was something he needed to understand first. What could he possibly say after so much silence? "I heard the truth" sounded accusatory. "I miss you" felt too large for an opening. "Can we talk" seemed almost too small. Every sentence carried a history behind it. So he did something unexpected. He put the phone back down. Not because he had changed his mind. Because this time, he refused to act from impulse. He wanted the first words you heard from him to be honest, not perfect. Gentle, not dramatic. Something that gave you freedom to respond however you truly felt. And as he sat there considering those words, the third party said one final thing from across the room. "There's something else you should know before you contact her." His eyes lifted immediately. She hesitated again, but this hesitation felt different. She wasn't trying to hide anything now. She looked almost relieved to finally stop carrying it. Then she told him there was a reason you had stepped back that he had never been told. A reason connected not to lack of love, not to another person, but to something he himself had said during one conversation, a sentence he barely remembered, yet you apparently remembered perfectly. And when she repeated that sentence to him, his expression changed completely, because he suddenly understood the moment you began believing that staying close to him might hurt more than letting him go. "My beloved child," the sentence she repeated was ordinary enough that he almost couldn't believe it had mattered so much. He remembered saying it casually, during a moment when he was frustrated and emotionally guarded, never realizing you would carry those words long after the conversation ended. He had told you, in one form or another, that maybe keeping some distance was easier than trying to understand something that felt complicated. To him, it had been a temporary reaction. To you, it had sounded like an answer. You didn't argue. You didn't demand reassurance. You simply listened, absorbed what he said, and stepped back because you believed respecting his words was kinder than forcing yourself into a space where you might not be wanted. And suddenly he understood something that made every memory after that feel different. You hadn't disappeared because you stopped caring. You had stepped away because you believed that was what he had asked you to do. For a long moment, he stared at nothing. The third party continued speaking, but he barely heard her because his own memory was filling in details now. Your expression during that conversation. The unusual quietness in your voice. The way you had paused before saying something gentle and leaving the moment without creating conflict. He remembered thinking you were strangely calm. Now he wondered whether that calmness had required more strength than he ever recognized. Don't skip, because this was the point where the confrontation stopped being about what the third party had hidden and became something much more personal. He began confronting himself. Not cruelly. Not with endless regret. With honesty. He realized that he had expected you to understand feelings he had never clearly expressed, while taking your reactions at face value without asking what they meant. He had wanted you to recognize that his words came from confusion, yet he never gave you the same grace when your silence came from uncertainty. And once he saw that imbalance, something softened inside him. She thought I wanted her gone, he whispered. The third party nodded. She thought you had already made your choice. Those words landed differently because, in his mind, he had never made that choice. He had simply delayed making any choice at all. But delay can sometimes look exactly like rejection to the person waiting on the other side. That realization brought him back to all those moments when he wondered why you didn't fight harder, why you didn't keep reaching out, why you seemed to accept the distance so quietly. He had interpreted your restraint as proof that you didn't feel deeply enough. Now he saw another possibility. Perhaps you felt deeply enough to respect what you believed he wanted, even when it wasn't what you wanted yourself. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party then admitted something she had never expected to say aloud. She told him you had once asked about him after that conversation not to interfere, not to pull him back, but because you wanted to make sure he was genuinely okay. And when she realized you still cared, she chose not to tell him. Why? Because she knew what would happen if he understood that you had not closed your heart in anger. She feared he would begin questioning every assumption he had made. She feared he would remember how natural the connection once felt. Most of all, she feared that if he heard your side directly, he might discover that the distance between you had been created more by misunderstanding than by absence of feeling. He listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in hearing her admit it. No desire to make her feel small. He only felt a strange sadness about how unnecessary some of the distance had been. Two people had been interpreting each other through fragments while the simplest solution in honest conversation had remained untouched. And that sadness quickly became something else, responsibility. Because whatever the third party had withheld, he knew he could not place every missed opportunity at her feet. He had also chosen not to ask. He had also accepted convenient explanations. He had also been afraid of what direct honesty might require from him. That understanding mattered. It meant that if he approached you now, he wouldn't arrive pointing fingers at someone else. He would arrive prepared to own his part. Stay till the end, because the first message he began writing was nothing like the dramatic confession the third party expected. He picked up his phone again, opened your name, and typed slowly, "I think there are things I misunderstood, and I realize I never gave you enough space to explain them in your own words." He stared at the sentence. Then added another, "I don't want to assume how you feel now. I only want to say I'm sorry for the ways I interpreted your silence without asking what was behind it." His thumb stopped. Something about those words felt vulnerable, but also clean. There was no pressure in them. No request for you to repair the past. No claim that discovering new information entitled him to your attention. Just acknowledgement. And that was important, because he was finally beginning to understand that reconnecting with someone is not about finding the perfect phrase that guarantees a response. It is about being honest enough to leave room for their truth too. He read the message again and almost sent it. Then one detail stopped him. A memory of something you once told him, "I don't need perfect words. I just need to know they're real." He smiled faintly because suddenly he could hear you saying it as clearly as if you were standing nearby. So he deleted half the message. Not because it was wrong. Because it sounded too polished. Too carefully protected. He wanted to speak like himself. He typed again, "I've been thinking about something I should have understood a long time ago. I think I listened to assumptions instead of asking you directly. If you're ever comfortable talking, I'd like to hear your side. No pressure. I just wanted to say that honestly." This time he didn't immediately second-guess it. The third party watched him, realizing the conversation had reached a place she could no longer influence. Yet what happened next surprised both of them. He still didn't press send. He placed the phone beside him and asked her one last question. "Was there ever anything she said about me that you didn't tell me because it didn't fit what you wanted me to believe?" Her face changed again. There it was, the final locked door. Not a dramatic secret. something far more intimate. She hesitated long enough for him to know the answer was yes. Then, quietly, she admitted there had been one conversation where you had spoken about him with more kindness than she expected. You weren't angry. You weren't trying to make yourself look right. You had simply said that you believed he was confused, not heartless. You said you hoped someday he would understand that you never wanted to compete for a place in his life. You wanted to be chosen freely or not at all. And then you said one final thing she had never repeated to him: if he ever comes back to speak honestly, I'll listen to the truth. But I won't chase a version of him that doesn't know what it wants. He lowered his head when he heard that. Those words felt so unmistakably like you that there was no need to question whether they had been embellished. They carried the exact balance he remembered: care without surrendering self-respect, softness without losing boundaries. And for the first time, he understood why your absence had never felt entirely like an ending. You hadn't left behind bitterness. You had left behind space. What happened with that space was no longer yours to control. It was his responsibility to decide whether he would ever become honest enough to cross it. The third party looked at him and asked, "So what are you going to do?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the unsent message on his phone and then toward the window, as though somewhere beyond that room was the life he had avoided examining too closely. Finally he said, "I'm going to stop making decisions based on what I'm afraid the answer might be." That sentence was different from everything he had said before. It wasn't a declaration about you. It was a decision about himself. And perhaps that was the real turning point. Because meaningful change rarely begins with chasing another person. It begins when someone becomes willing to stop hiding from their own truth. He picked up the phone again. This time his hand was steady. The message remained simple. Honest. Open. He pressed send. And then nothing happened. No immediate reply. No dramatic sign. Just a quiet screen and the awareness that somewhere, perhaps moments later, your phone would display words you had once wondered whether you would ever receive. He didn't panic. He didn't send another message. He understood that your response belonged to you. So he waited, not with expectation, but with respect. Minutes passed. The third party eventually left the room, and he remained there alone with thoughts that felt strangely calmer than they had in months. The truth hadn't given him certainty about what would happen next. It had given him something better, clarity about what he wanted to do differently. He wanted direct conversations. He wanted fewer assumptions. He wanted the courage to ask instead of guessing. And whether your connection became something new or simply found closure through honesty, he knew that was already more meaningful than living inside a story neither of you had actually written together. Then, just when he had convinced himself not to keep checking the screen, his phone lit up. Your name appeared. One message. Short. He looked at it for several seconds before opening it, almost afraid that his old habits would begin interpreting before he had even read your words. But this time, he promised himself he would take them exactly as you gave them. He opened the message. Your first sentence was gentle. Your second surprised him. But it was the final line that made him sit completely still, because it revealed that you had known far more about the third party's interference than anyone realized, and you had chosen silence for a reason he was only now about to understand. The final line on your message made him read it twice, then a third time, because it quietly changed the meaning of everything he thought had happened between you. You wrote that you had known for a while that certain things you said were not reaching him the way you intended. You had noticed conversations returning to you with details altered, intentions misunderstood, and moments interpreted in ways that didn't feel like your own voice. But instead of confronting everyone around him, you made a choice that he had never understood until now. You stopped trying to prove yourself. Not because you didn't care. Not because you had nothing left to say. You stepped back because you realized that if he could only trust you after you fought endlessly against someone else's version of you, then the connection would never feel safe for either of you. That realization hit him quietly. He had spent months wondering why you didn't defend yourself harder, never considering that perhaps your silence was itself a boundary. You were waiting to see whether he would eventually ask you directly instead of allowing every answer to arrive through another person. And now, for the first time, he had. Don't skip, because what you said next reached somewhere deeper than the secret itself. You told him you were never expecting him to choose sides. You had never wanted him to see the third party as an enemy. What hurt was simpler: he had stopped asking questions. He had accepted conclusions about your heart without giving your own words equal weight. You could handle disagreement. You could handle distance. What became difficult was feeling as though a version of you existed in his mind that you had never been allowed to correct. He rested the phone against his palm, staring at those words. There was no accusation in them. That somehow made them more powerful. You weren't trying to make him feel guilty. You were explaining what the experience had felt like from where you stood. And because you weren't demanding anything from him, he could finally hear it without becoming defensive. Something inside him softened. He realized that every time he had wondered why you became quieter, you had likely been wondering why he stopped seeing you clearly. Every time he thought you were pulling away, perhaps you were simply protecting yourself from repeatedly explaining intentions that should have been heard the first time. And then came the sentence he wasn't prepared for. I knew someone was influencing how you saw me, but I wanted to know whether you would eventually remember who I actually was without me having to compete with their opinion. He closed his eyes. Because he did remember. That was the part he could no longer deny. Beneath every explanation, beneath every outside interpretation, there had always been his own experience of you. It had never completely disappeared. He remembered your patience when he was difficult to understand. He remembered the way you listened without immediately trying to fix him. He remembered how carefully you chose your words when emotions were high. Most of all, he remembered that being around you had once felt uncomplicated before other voices entered the space between you. And suddenly he understood something rare. The secret the third party had hidden was important, but perhaps the greater truth was that he had always possessed enough information to question the story. He simply hadn't trusted himself enough to do it. Stay till the end, because his response to you was different from what he might have written even one day earlier. He didn't tell you that the third party had ruined everything. He didn't promise that everything would instantly become different. He wrote, "You were right to expect me to ask you directly. I should have. I can see now that I kept waiting for certainty from everyone except the one person whose perspective actually mattered." He paused before continuing. I don't know what this means for us yet. I don't want to rush that. But I do want to understand what happened without assumptions between us. He sent it and felt something unexpected afterward, not anxiety, but relief. He wasn't trying to control your answer anymore. He was finally giving the conversation room to become whatever it honestly needed to become. Your reply didn't arrive immediately. During that silence, he began thinking about the third party in a completely different way. Her actions still mattered. The hidden information still mattered. But he no longer needed to make her the center of the story. That was perhaps the biggest shift of all. For so long, the connection between you had become defined by who said what, who interfered, who misunderstood, who withheld something. Now he wanted to remove all of that noise and ask one much simpler question: what remained between you when nobody else was speaking? The answer wasn't something he could invent alone. It would require both of you. That understanding kept him grounded. Then your next message arrived. You told him there was one reason you had never confronted the third party directly. At first, you had considered it. You had imagined explaining every missing detail and correcting every false interpretation. But then you realized something: the moment you started fighting for control over the narrative, you would become part of the exact dynamic that was hurting you. So instead, you chose to let your actions remain consistent. You trusted that if he ever looked closely enough, the difference between what he had been told and who you actually were would eventually become visible. It wasn't guaranteed. You knew that. You accepted that perhaps he might never see it. Yet you chose peace over proving yourself. He read those words slowly. Something important is waiting for you here, because that choice suddenly explained an old mystery he had never solved. There had been moments after your distance began when he expected anger from you. Instead, you had been unexpectedly gracious. There had been opportunities for you to embarrass the third party or expose private details, yet you never did. At the time, he assumed that meant you didn't care enough to fight. Now he understood that perhaps you cared too much about your own peace to turn connection into competition. And that realization changed how he saw strength. He had once mistaken loud certainty for confidence. Now he recognized how much confidence it must have required for you to walk away from the need to control what anyone believed. His phone remained in his hand while another memory surfaced. The last real conversation between you before the distance became permanent. He had been waiting for you to say something dramatic, something that would make his decision obvious. Instead, you had simply told him, "I hope one day you choose what feels true to you, not what feels easiest to explain to everyone else." He had forgotten that sentence. Or perhaps he had intentionally buried it because it came too close to something he wasn't ready to examine. Now it returned with perfect clarity. He finally understood what you had been trying to tell him. You weren't asking to be chosen over another person. You were asking him to become honest enough to make his own choices. That was different. And it was exactly what this confrontation had finally forced him to do. Later that evening, the third party contacted him again. Her message was calmer now. She didn't defend herself. She said she had been thinking about what happened and wanted to admit something else, not another hidden message, but the feeling beneath everything she had done. She had sensed from the beginning that his connection with you carried something she couldn't easily imitate. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. But because he became more emotionally present around you. He listened differently. He questioned himself differently. She had mistaken that depth for something she needed to compete against, and the more insecure she became, the more carefully she controlled what information reached him. Reading that admission, he felt no triumph. Only understanding. He replied with kindness but also clarity. He told her that whatever happened next, he needed space from anyone interpreting his feelings for him. He wanted to make his own decisions. He wished her well, but he was finished participating in conversations where someone else's fear decided what he was allowed to know. It was perhaps the calmest boundary he had ever set. No argument. No punishment. Just a door closing on an old pattern. And strangely, once he set that boundary, the entire situation stopped feeling like a battle. Nobody needed to win. Nobody needed to lose. He simply needed to stop abandoning his own judgment. Hours later, you and he were still exchanging occasional messages. Not constantly. Neither of you rushed. There were pauses between sentences, almost as though both of you understood how important it was not to fill every silence with assumptions again. He asked questions he should have asked long ago. You answered some directly. Others required more thought. And when you said, "I'm not ready to talk about that part yet," he surprised you by responding, "That's okay." No pressure followed. No attempt to pull more from you than you were ready to give. That tiny exchange mattered more than either of you said aloud. Because for the first time in a long while, there was room between you without confusion filling it. Room could simply be room. Silence could simply mean someone was thinking. A delayed reply didn't automatically mean rejection. Neither of you had to interpret every detail as proof of something larger. And inside that slower rhythm, a different kind of connection began appearing, not the old connection exactly, but something potentially more honest. Then you asked him a question he hadn't expected. What made you finally question what you were being told? He stared at the screen because there were several possible answers. The contradiction. The confrontation. The hidden message. But none of those felt complete. Eventually he wrote, "Because I realized the version of you I was hearing about didn't match the person I remembered." That answer made you pause longer than usual. When you finally responded, there were only a few words, "I hoped you would remember." He felt those words deeply. Not because they promised reconciliation. They didn't. But because they revealed something he had not realized: you had never needed him to believe you were flawless. You had simply hoped his own memories would eventually matter more than someone else's interpretation. And now they did. The following morning, he woke earlier than usual. For the first time in months, your situation wasn't the first thing he experienced as confusion. There was uncertainty, yes, but uncertainty no longer felt frightening. It felt honest. He didn't know whether you would rebuild something, remain friends, or simply find the closure neither of you had received before. Yet whatever came next would belong to the two people actually involved. That alone felt like progress. Then, while he was still considering whether to send you a simple morning message, your name appeared first. You had sent something during the early hours. Not a long paragraph. not an emotional declaration. Just one photograph from the past, a place the two of you once talked about visiting together, and beneath it, one line: "I found this yesterday and almost deleted it, but now I think you should know why I kept it." He opened the photograph, enlarged it, and immediately noticed something written faintly in the corner that he had never seen before. A date. A short sentence. And when he realized when you had written it, he understood that there was still one part of your story neither the third party nor he had ever known, because you had made a private decision about him long before everything fell apart, and you were finally ready to explain what it meant.